Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. India's GDP growth surged by 6.3% in the September quarter, in an indication that the Indian economy has shaken off the lingering effects of demonetization last year and GST rollout on the 1st of July. India's economic growth had slowed to 5.7% in the June quarter. The GDP data for the September quarter came on a day when it was reported that India's fiscal deficit at the end of October hit 96.1% of the budget estimate for 2017-18. The IMF has pared its growth forecast for the Indian economy by half a percentage point to 6.7% for 2017-18. Both the Asian Development Bank as well as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development have also cut their growth projections for India to 7% and 6.7% respectively. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the Q2 GDP data. Joining me on the program today are T.K. Arun, Editor, Opinion, The Economic Times; Nitin Desai, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India; N.R. Bhanumurthy, NIPFP; and we'll be joined on the phone line by Anil Agarwal, former President, ASSOCHAM. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Let me start with the journalists first. T.K. Arun, what do you make of the latest GDP Q2 data?
See, this is not any great surprise. Nobody really thought that right in the second quarter, GDP would gallop ahead at any fast rate. For me, the most interesting statistic is the rise in the tax burden on the economy. In Q2 of 16-17, the indirect tax burden, net indirect tax burden, was 7.6% of GDP. In this data that has come out today, the net tax burden, net of subsidy, is 7.83% of GDP. So, all that GST has managed to achieve so far is to raise the tax component of GDP by 0.2%. Sorry, 0.02%. So, this is not actually enough. We need to collect more taxes to be able to provide people with the services that the government needs to provide. But this is only the initial years of GDP, of GST, and going forward, I'm hopeful that things will improve. I think, to my mind, this is the most revealing information to come out from this data. If you look at the investment figures, that is in current nominal price terms is below 27%. The gross fixed capital formation as a proportion of GDP has fallen below 27%. So, which means the expected pickup in growth and investment, we are still waiting for it.
Sure. Mr. Desai, taking this point forward, the point of revenue collection. Revenue collection has been the lowest in October ever since GST has come into effect on July 1st, 2017. In October, we collected about 83,000 crore rupees. So, I mean, how much of an impact has GST had on the GDP?
I would say that if you look at the difference between the gross value added, which would be comparable to the old GDP numbers, and GDP, the difference is basically indirect taxes. And I would focus more attention on the GVA, 6.1% GVA increase. The reason is you're getting 6.3% GDP increase because there's a big boost in the indirect tax component. I just did a little calculation. The Q2 18 on last year's Q2 is up by 17-18% because they've used the GSTR filing numbers for this purpose. So I would, in terms of looking at what's happening in the economy, look at the 6.1%. Their manufacturing, which is basically the manufacturing data, is essentially for the corporate sector because it's drawn from the Ministry of Company Affairs. And as far as the rest is concerned, they're relying on some connection with IIP. So it probably hasn't captured the sort of disruption of small units that newspapers have been talking about. I don't think that will make a huge difference when they finally come out with the numbers in due course after a year or so, because the corporate still accounts for a pretty large chunk, according to them, 70% of manufacturing output. I think the continuing decline in investment is a cause of concern. It remains, it still continues to decline. And that, I think, is a cause for concern. As far as the overall number is concerned, 6.1% is probably a little lower than what was expected. People were expecting something 6.3, 6.4, 6.5 or thereabouts.
Or the GVA you're talking about.
Of the GVA. And that is what the expectation was. Now, most people are looking at GVA, let's be very frank.
Sure.
Because the other number gets distorted by the fact that this year you had a big change in the indirect tax system. So I think there will be a slight disappointment. I had argued that if it is below 6, worry. If it is between 6 and 7, okay, maybe things are starting to improve. And if it's above 7, relax.
Okay.
But the fact is, it is just above 6, you see. And I think ideally we would have liked to see around 6.3, 6.4 or thereabouts. Nevertheless, I would say that after many quarters of continuing decline, we at last have a quarter where it has actually gone up slightly from 5.7 to 6.1. You know, it's gone up slightly. So it's some reason for comfort, but not too much. Don't get too relaxed.
Okay, sure. Let me go across to N.R. Bhanumurthy now of the NIPFB. You know, as far as 6.3 is concerned, it's clearly better than what we saw in Q1 of 5.7. But what happens to our overall target for this fiscal? In the budget estimate, it was between 7 to 7.5%. Will we still be able to achieve that in Q3 and Q4?
Well, I think I agree with Dr. Nitin Desai. We need to really look at GVA numbers for understanding the overall economic activity. But if you look at these numbers, I take a slightly positive view on the overall trend. I think the first thing is that the slowdown is over. I think in history now. We are seeing a recovery, and recovery seems to be almost broad-based, except a couple of sectors like financial sector and agriculture as well as construction. If you compare with the Q1 of 2017-18, we do see a sharp recovery in manufacturing sector, which was the sector we expect that it should have taken a deep hit because of demonetization as well as GST. So there is a sharp recovery from 1.2 to 7%. And in fact, if you have heard the chief statistician's interview today, he is almost hinting that the revised numbers of this QT is going to be mostly upward, because there are some information that was not available for estimation of Q2. So in a sense, I think there is a certain recovery in the overall economic activity, and I bet on a little more than 6.1% when the final numbers come in. And your question about the overall for the whole financial year, I am little more optimistic than many forecasters that the overall for the whole of 2017-18, I think the GDP should hit close to 7%. And this is largely based on our own estimation.
Sure.
And also, if you take the kind of measures, a number of measures the government has taken in the recent period, that should really result in better GDP numbers. And at the same time, one should not really forget, there is a consistent recovery in the overall external demand, because even IMF and World Bank is predicting a much better GDP numbers for the world as well as the industrial countries. So overall, yes, it's a very positive number. I would say that there is a recovery, and my guess is that when the final numbers come, it will be little more stronger recovery than what we are seeing today.
Sure. All right. Okay. Let me go across to Anil Agarwal now, who's joining us on the phone line. You know, as far as this data that was released today is concerned, is it in line with the forecast, say, of the IMF or any other such organizations?
Well, first of all, I think we have to do a little cheer up to ourselves that the numbers have come in a way that were not expected, and everybody was talking about a little pessimistic. But the numbers are looking good, and this is finally the impact is that there is a turnaround, and there is a lot of informal sector coming into the formal sector, which is getting imbibed into the GDP numbers. So we believe that slowly, as the GST impact on certain sectors which is still not able to take the load, and wherein there is some there are still some fringes to be ironed out by the government, which the government is taking steps to do so. We shall see that in the next quarter there will be better numbers coming in, and this will give us the possibility to have a better growth number in the next quarter. So the overall impact of the GST would be a positive one as soon as the government of India is able to iron out the difficulties being faced by different sectors. So, you know, there is still a question mark of the refund of the GST because the working capital is getting impacted. There is still a question mark on you know, certain informal sector coming in slowly into the formal sector. So once this happens, I'm sure that we will have better days ahead.
Okay. All right. You know, TK Arun, what are the factors or what are the sectors that have contributed to this growth that we've seen from Q1 to Q2?
So, see, I mean, all this data will have to be will subsequently be revised. Now, I am very skeptical about the manufacturing data, because large manufacturing data today is based on the financial reporting that companies do, and during the phase of demonetization, surprisingly, our manufacturing data was very robust. I suspect that companies actually, in order to bring a lot of hitherto undisclosed income onto the books, showed robust sales and robust profits and filed tax and declared, and based on this, the GDP numbers showed a robust manufacturing growth. Now, this has to dissipate over time. So, we are seeing GDP growth of
6.3% in Q2.
No, not GDP. I'm saying
GVA 6.1%.
Manufacturing growth.
It's at 7%.
7%. So
from 1.2% in Q1.
Yeah. So manufacturing growth, I don't know how it will actually finally shape up. The remarkable thing is that the discrepancy between the pace at which electricity generation grows and manufacturing grows still continues to be large. This has been one of the sustained puzzles in our national income accounting. If industry is growing so slowly, who is absorbing all this power? Power continues to grow at the same time the power sector is in shambles. Nobody, no state utility is in a position to actually pay their suppliers. They already bit up dues of more than 20,000 crores to power generation companies. But power generation continues at a rapid pace. This is a slight mystery that eventually, hopefully, will be cleared up. So, the most crucial number is the investment number, and that is now below 27% of GDP.
Yeah.
Gross fixed capital formation as a proportion of GDP. Now, so long as this remains low, the ability of the economy to pick up steam is doubtful.
Okay. And Mr.
But on the whole,
yeah,
growth, the decline in growth has bottomed out. That is clear. The world economy is growing faster. Also, exports should actually grow faster, and that should drive some revival in overall growth.
So there's an upward trend is what you're suggesting, yes. But a lot more needs to be done so that we can always improve, and there's scope for improvement is what you're suggesting. Okay. You know, Mr. Desai, what are the worrying signs for you as far as these figures are concerned, and how do we correct these worrying signs?
I would say
how
that if I were to now focusing more on policy and what should be done, I think the figures are such that I would not argue for a generalized demand boost. But what I would argue for is something more directed at investment, because that continuing downward trend in investment is a disturbing feature. And you're also seeing this in something like construction. You know, one of the sectors which has not grown well is construction. So I would say that this is what I would focus attention on. For the year as a whole, I have great respect for, and I would go by Bhanu Murthy's assessment because they do a proper model and they work things out. But it is quite a big call. I mean, you have to get close to 8% in the remaining 2 quarters in order to get 7.
Because the mean is 6 now.
The mean is 6. So you have to get to close to 8 to get to 7 for the year as a whole. I don't know how they'll do it. Plus signs on the global economy side are the fact that the Western countries are consolidating, growing. Export growth is picking up. The weak point which we should be careful about is oil prices. We have had a bonanza of falling oil prices over the past 2-3 years, and that looks a little more uncertain now, and that could cause some balance of payments issues, though I wouldn't worry excessively because we do have large reserves. And so, but nevertheless, it is something that we should be keeping in mind. So, and that may have a fiscal problem.
Sure.
That may have a, it may hit you on the fiscal deficit side. But I hope they don't do anything terribly stupid in order to stick to the FRBM target. The economy is moving, keep it moving. Don't focus more on the real growth rather than just FRBM targets.
Sure. You know, Professor Bhanumurthy, as far as agriculture, and let's look at some of the other sectors, and let's go into some of the specific sectors. Do you believe that agriculture is still a worrisome sector? And what about services? How do you think services are doing?
Well, I think agriculture is something which many of us don't understand how it is going to play out because it depends on many, unanticipated factors. So one thing we can talk about is that on the back of robust growth in the last couple of years, maybe we are going to settle around 2% for the current year, which is the long-term average. But in any case, there are some initial information that's coming up. There is a mixed kind of a news that some products are doing well, some regions are doing well. So in a sense, I'm not going to be more optimistic on the agriculture, and I think even if we can grow at 2%, that is going to be a much better satisfying growth. But in terms of service sector, as everybody pointed out, I think there is a little bit of slowdown in the numbers are showing up. But I think it's also because in the current year, a lot of front loading has happened already in the overall government, expenditures. I think I always used to believe that, as part of the 14th Finance Commission, when there was a larger devolution to the states, I think the states seems to be sitting on huge unspent balances. And I think the second half of the current financial year, you might see that the expenditure happening at the state level. So if that happens, my guess is that, we'll see a much better service sector growth, particularly the, if you talk about the broad tertiary sector growth. But as I said earlier, I think the trade, finance, and these two sectors is linked strongly with the global economy. And now that we are expecting a slightly better growth in the world economy, I think we should expect better numbers in these two subsectors also in the next couple of quarters.
Quarters, yeah.
So overall, as I said, I agree with Dr. Nitin Desai. Yes, I agree with Dr. Nitin Desai that I may be a little more optimistic. But if you look at the kind of drivers of the growth, I would, and if you take, in fact, I said in one of the discussions in the Rajya Sabha TV itself, this year I think we are going to see a recovery in the growth largely through the confidence channel. I think that has been really shown up in the ease of doing business as well as the Moody's upgrade. And we're also seeing the initial reaction from the foreign direct investors.
Sure.
So if that continues, I think we'll be close to what, as I already said, 7% growth by the end of 2018.
Okay, optimism is always a good thing, and let's hope that we do meet that target of 7% overall growth for this fiscal. But Mr. Agarwal, is the worst over for the economy, or do you believe that or do you believe that there are still some troubling times ahead? Okay, we seem to have lost the line there with Mr. Agarwal. But TK Arun, the same question to you. Do you think the worst is over for the Indian economy after seeing a slump of 5.7% in Q1? This is definitely a recovery.
See, economic growth doesn't happen in isolation. You have other developments in the economy. You have the bank's bad debt problem being resolved in a manner in which many companies feel they are being expropriated, that their assets are being taken away from them. Now, in the case of certain large companies, it is difficult for the public to sympathize with the promoter who stands to lose his assets. But large numbers of small companies and medium companies, the only bidders who might come forward to offer a resolution plan would be they themselves. Now, if they stand disqualified from bidding for these assets, it is possible that they will just be liquidated. And if that happens, then it will take time for these companies to come back to a situation where they can start production. So that will again impact growth. So I am not all that optimistic. Given the dip in the investment figure, the gross fixed capital formation figure, I would be surprised if we manage to reach the 6.7% growth figure, which is the RBI's own estimate.
Okay. And Mr. Desai, you know, as far as Q3 and Q4 are concerned, what are the sectors that we need to watch out for, and where do you think that the growth might come from?
I would say the growth, I'm expecting something significant from the export sector. Exports are looking up, and so is the world economy. So we may see some better performance on the export front. I think the small industry sector has still got time to, it will need time, particularly with these things, the point which Arun was mentioning, that a lot of them who are under this insolvency sword will probably have to shut down because under the new provisions they can't bid. Sometimes I expect, government becomes too reactive. Now that the amendment was a response to actually one case where this happened. Now don't overreact. You can always take care of that sort of thing, which was probably a distortion, without doing it on this broad brush basis, because he's right. If you take the 70% or so of the small industries which are in this category, nobody is going to bid for them. And what's going to happen not just to the entrepreneur, but what about the workers in those units? So I think sometimes the policy is too reactive. They should have thought through this right in the beginning. They didn't think through it, okay, make a small amendment in order to this, but it was basically a reaction to one case, the provisions which have been made.
One big case. One big case.
One big case. Now take care of that. But nowhere in most countries in the world you do allow existing owners to bid, unless existing owners are under some sort of charge of malfeasance, on misappropriation or something.
Yes.
If they're not under that charge, if it is a legitimate reason why the business is run into trouble, then the Chapter 11 in US and elsewhere, they're allowed to bid. And so I'd say that be clear as to what should be done and do that, and don't be worried too much about public outcry about one case here or one case there. Learn to brazen it out.
You know, Professor Balmurthy, another cause of concern, of course, is India's fiscal deficit, which has reached 96% of the FY18 target at the end of October. How much of a concern do you believe that that is?
This is one number I had never believed, actually. I never taken seriously, sorry. For a simple reason is that, there's always a huge volatility in the expenditures, revenues, and that will show up in the fiscal deficit also. As we know that, the expenditures have been front-loaded, but the revenues are going to come up at the later stage. So in a sense, I think this 96% I don't really buy. I think the finance minister very clearly said that he is not going to, exceed the 3.2%. But I think one needs to really be a little more cautious here. It's very difficult at this juncture to really predict whether we are going to stick to 3.2%, largely because of the kind of ambiguity that we have on the GSTs and the GST revenues. And as somebody said that the refunds are still not being done, and we don't have much clarity about how much we are going to generate. We don't know what is the revenue buoyancy under the GST. Given this kind of a black box at the moment, predicting this 3.2% by the end of March is going to be a big task. Ultimately, maybe there is going to be some kind of a compromise on some of the expenditure, and the easiest is going to be on the capital expenditure part of it. So we have to really wait and see. In any case, now if the recovery is going to be, if the GDP recovers much faster than 6.1% for the next half of the financial year, maybe we'll have much better tax collections, and that should help achieve the 3.2% fiscal deficit. So in any case, this 96%, I just don't take it seriously.
All right. Okay. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.